myself. I am Wayne Squire. I was a neuropathologist in the University of Oxford for 40 years, and my principal role in that job was to examine the brains of babies who have died, fetuses who've died in utero before they're born, babies born who've died around the time of birth, and babies dying in the first year of life. And for the vast majority of my career, I studied these brains to look at how the brain develops, how it can be affected by trauma, by infection, by lack of oxygen, and so on. And over the last 10, 20 years of my career, I started to give evidence in the courts as an expert witness. And some of those cases were potentially abuse cases. And it was in the course of studying those cases that I came to question the shaken baby hypothesis and to believe that it wasn't based on good scientific evidence, and it was not a sufficiently scientific diagnosis to be able to be used. The debate still rages around the world. The shaken baby syndrome, abusive head trauma debate is hugely controversial. And I think in every country where the shaken baby syndrome diagnosis is made, it remains challenged by those who want to maintain the status quo and hang on to this hypothesis, and those who feel that it's not scientific and new data, new science must replace the old thoughts about shaken baby syndrome. Now, there has been a lot of work coming out of the United States. And in fact, in recent years, there have been a number of convictions overturned and people have been freed from prison because the old hypothesis has been challenged. Another aspect has been in the United States where certainly one judge has made a decision based on the fact that he believes you cannot say that this is shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma, because that is a diagnosis that a doctor cannot make. He can describe what the findings are, he can suggest what may be the cause of those findings, but a doctor cannot diagnose abuse or even shaking, because those are both willful and aggressive and acts which it's not within the remit of a doctor to make that particular diagnosis. In other countries of the world, I know that in Australia, they've had some success recently in the courts in putting forward the argument that an expert who says this baby was shaken and the bridging veins were torn, which is one of the arguments in the shaken baby hypothesis. When you shake a baby, you tear the bridging veins, which are on the surface of the brain up here, and that causes bleeding. And unless you can demonstrate the tearing of the vessels at autopsy, you cannot stand up and make that diagnosis because it is a hypothesis. And that's being regarded as not sufficient in the courts in Australia. And one of the places where some very good research is happening is in Sweden, because they have a system of recording data on babies who are admitted to hospital, and they can go back into their archives and find very accurate information about all of their babies admitted to hospital. And using this data, they have produced some really interesting papers showing, for example, that babies who were said to have been shaken because the parents came and admitted they shook their babies didn't actually have the features of shaken baby syndrome. They didn't have retinal hemorrhages and they didn't have subdural hemorrhages. They've shown that the babies who do have retinal hemorrhages usually have some pathology in the brain as well. And they've also shown that babies who have subdural hemorrhage are likely to have had problems around birth and the early weeks of their life. And so this epidemiological research is really very valuable. And as far as I know, this is really the only place where this quality of research has been possible because of the data which is collected routinely in Sweden. I think the most important thing that we must do is to have an open debate. We have to bring to the table all of our evidence from both sides of this debate so that we can see what we're saying and argue it out until we can reach some form of agreement. And I think the most important thing is that proper empirical scientific evidence must be the basis for deciding on this diagnosis. There's no point in saying we think it happens because we've seen it before. I've seen other cases. That's not good enough. This sounds to me like a tragic miscarriage of justice, in that my understanding, having looked at the scans and looked at the pictures of the autopsy, are that this baby has blood clot in the blood vessels around the brain, one of them being infections. And this baby had an infective myocarditis, as far as I understand. I'm not a cardiac pathologist, but I've read the reports and seen the pictures. And it looks as if the heart was very badly damaged by an inflammatory process. Now, this can have a secondary effect of increasing the tendency of the blood to clot and causing blood clots to form in the blood vessels around the brain. I think the collapse was probably caused by the heart condition. And then she had this prolonged period of hypoxia, which would have caused brain damage, and the coagulopathy, which would have caused blood clotting. Now, why wasn't it abusive head trauma? First of all, this is an older baby than most. Most shaken babies are 6 months old or younger than 6 months. It would be almost impossible for a person to shake a baby of 2 years sufficiently to damage the neck and the blood vessels in the brain. Firstly, because of the weight. If you ask American university students to shake a model of the baby, they actually fatigue after 10 seconds or so. They find it very difficult to maintain shaking for the time it was thought to be necessary to cause damage. And finally, if this was due to abuse and shaking, then the baby would certainly have had to have damage in the neck, because the neck has to flip back and forwards to cause the damage to the brain. And there would have been evidence of bruising or fractures where the baby would have had to be gripped really hard to shake, especially at 2 years. So I think that's a hypothesis which really doesn't work on various different levels. But I'm terribly sorry they've had to go through all of this. And I do very much hope that you, the legal team, will be able to see justice done. I'm delighted to say that I was involved in the Shaken Baby Review project, having been at your first meeting, and was able to speak at that meeting. And it was just a great pleasure to meet people such as you, who are absolutely passionate about finding the truth and preventing wrongful convictions. And so I wish you all very well, a good first 5 years. You seem to have had enormous success with many cases being overturned. And so I hope that you will continue to go forward and be even stronger in preventing wrongful convictions.